All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Willie Sanders. I'm going to be your instructor today for systems administration and maintenance. In today's topic, we're going to be talking about security fundamentals. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Hey, this is systems administration class. Why are we talking about security? Isn't that like a whole nother lane in information technology? And if you said that, you'd be correct. Yes, there is a dedicated, systems discipline security discipline underneath of the umbrella of IT. But as you know, if you've taken a security class before, security is everyone's responsibility. And as the Swiss Army knife for the IT department, definitely security is going to fall into the purview of a systems administrator. So it's critical that you have a solid foundation in security fundamental principles if you're going to take on a role of a sysadmin. So let's get to it. First up, if you're going to be talking about anything in security, you got to start off with this concept, the concepts of the CIA triad. This is what all of cybersecurity is built around. It's not like CIA, like the government agency. CIA here stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality means that you're not allowing anyone who doesn't have authorized access to get into whatever your resource is. It could be a building, it could be a system, it could be getting access to data. But the key thing there is only people who are supposed to get into those things are allowed to get into them. Integrity is talking about the ability to change things, right? So I might allow somebody access to something, but that doesn't necessarily mean I want them altering it. If I'm a bank, I want my customers to be able to go in and view their account information, but I don't want them to be able to change their balance without depositing money, right? I don't want them typing in, 3 extra zeros into their bank account. We only want authorized changes to happen. And integrity tracks that. And then availability, that's probably the most straightforward one. Either something is available or is not available. But when we're protecting availability, we're making sure that those authorized individuals who are supposed to have access to a resource can get access to it whenever they need access to it. So let's use the bank account example again. If I'm a bank, I want my customers to have access to log into their online web portal to check their account, whether it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's one of the services that we're providing them. They are authorized to check their account, so they should be able to get on that website and log in to check it whenever they feel like it. Now, the examples I just presented only show the kind of like the IT side of the CIA triad. But the thing that we have to consider is that bad guys know about the CIA triad too. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to be attacking these different concepts. They're going to be trying to compromise confidentiality so that they can get unauthorized access. They're going to try to compromise integrity so they can make changes without having permission to make changes. And they're going to try to take down your availability or a company's availability to a resource because they want to block you from doing business. They want to block you from doing something, just block you from having access that you're supposed to have access to. So whether we're looking at it from the defender's perspective or the attacker's perspective, we always got to consider the CIA triad, because everything we do in security is either to protect this stuff, and on the bad guy side, they're trying to attack it. Of all the concepts, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the one that probably has the most substance to it is going to be this confidentiality one. So we're going to talk about some other supporting concepts that go along with confidentiality. Some terminology you need to be familiar with. One of these concepts is the idea of sensitivity. And this is going to talk about the quality of the information or the resource that you're trying to protect. Does this particular document, if it's leaked, is it going to cause astronomical harm to our organization? Is it going to destroy somebody's reputation if that piece of information gets out? If it is, then you would classify that as being a sensitive piece of information. and that's going to help you determine how you're going to protect it. Versus, oh, this is a flyer to next week's party, right? That's not highly sensitive. I'm not going to put the same level of effort in protecting that as I am the really important piece of information. Discretion is another concept you have to understand. Discretion is talking about the influence that somebody has over whether or not a piece of information, a piece of data gets shared. So in your home computer, right? You make a document on your home computer, like you make a Microsoft Word doc or something like that. That's your document, and it's your private document, right? So you, as the owner, get to decide. Hey, I want to share this with somebody else. I want to print out a copy. I'm gonna give it to this person over here. Or you say, no, I don't want to share it with anybody. I made the documents for my personal use, what have you. You can make that decision at your discretion. But not every environment gives you that same liberty. For example, if I work for the NSA and I write a document and that document gets classified as top secret, even though I wrote the document, I put all the words in there, the concept of my mind, you would think I can say, hey, I wrote this. I mean, I can share it with whoever I want to. You be wrong, because the government now is going to, at their discretion, decide who's allowed to see it and who's not allowed to see it. All right, so understand that concept. Next concept is criticality, or critical, we have here. And that's talking about how important this piece of information, this resource, is to the overall mission of whatever your organization is. So if I have a mission critical system or a mission critical piece of data, then if that data is compromised, it could hurt our mission, maybe even derail it. Versus on the other end of the spectrum, you got a resource that's not mission critical, is not as important, or not necessarily importance, but it won't derail the mission of our organization if it gets compromised. Concealment. This is one of our first terms we're talking about, where we're talking about ways to potentially protect confidentiality. Concealment is an act of hiding to prevent disclosure. So you're hiding the document inside of a folder that doesn't have a conspicuous name, or you're physically hiding a piece of equipment somewhere in a data center, so out of sight, out of mind, right? Not necessarily the best way of implementing security, but it is, can be part of your strategy for implementing security, but it shouldn't be the only thing you're relying on. The next is kind of goes along with it, is this concept of secrecy. So not only am I going to hide the thing that I'm trying to protect, I'm not going to tell anybody about it either. I'm not going to spend the time hiding this document and then go tell Jim over here, hey, Jim, hey, if you're ever looking for that document, it's hidden inside of this folder, in this folder, in this folder. And that's how you get to it. Because, maybe Jim is not good at keeping secrets, and he tells Tammy over here, and he's like, hey, Tammy, there's a folder in there. Next thing you know, everybody in the office knows where that hidden, concealed document is, right? So secrecy takes concealment to the next level by not sharing or disclosing the information that you're trying to keep secret. Privacy kind of goes along with this again, but privacy here is going to be referring more so to protecting someone's confidential information. So you probably heard a lot about privacy in the news, maybe, or maybe a lot about privacy in general. When you go visit websites now, for example, you get that little pop-up window on your computer that says, hey, do you want to accept these terms and conditions? This is what we're putting on your computer. We're going to put this cookie on your computer. It's going to collect some web tracking habits. Do you want us to do that, allow us to do that, or do you want to deny us the ability to do that? Before, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, before Europe passed their GDPR regulation. I hope I got my acronym right on that one. But it's basically a law protecting people's private information and forcing companies to disclose the fact that they're putting tracking software like cookies onto someone's computer to collect that type of private data before before they actually do it. Because before they would just throw them on your computer. Now they have to give you a heads up that this is what they are looking to collect from you as far as information goes, and then this is what they're going to do with it. And you've probably seen privacy statements other places. Your banks are required to send you a privacy statement in the mail or by email every so often, things like that, because your personal information is really important. So again, one of the key concepts of confidentiality is making sure that only authorized individuals have access to these protected resources. So definitely your private information, you want to keep that private, because if it got out there, maybe it could cause embarrassment, maybe it cause harm, maybe somebody could use it to discriminate against you. It doesn't matter. Privacy is huge, though. Seclusion. This is I'm kind of take it back to where we had concealment and secrecy. Another way of kind of implementing out of sight, out of mind. Seclusion might require you to store something in a way out of the way location. So instead of the example I gave with secrecy, hiding a piece of equipment, somewhere in a data center, and they're not telling anybody about it, so I can implement secrecy. Seclusion might be, I'm going to now not just hide it somewhere in my building. I'm shipping this thing across to another, city, and they're going to lock it up in a vault somewhere. We use seclusion a lot when we do backups. So one of the ways that we protect data backups is we'll make a copy maybe that we keep on site with us, but then we'll sometimes make a backup copy of that data and store it off site. So that's a way of not only protecting it from physically getting destroyed, but also you're keeping it way out of hand for anybody who might want to steal it. And then the last concept here is isolation. This is the act of separating your resource from all the other resources. So a good example of that is if let's say I have a computer system that has some data on it and an application on it that's so sensitive that I don't even want it to touch a computer network. So I isolate this network by doing something, or I isolate the system rather, by doing something called air gapping. Air gapping is when you physically have a system on an entirely different network, or maybe not even on a network at all. And it exists as like this standalone device that if you want to access, you literally have to go into the room with it to access it. So you might see that in like really, really high security environments where they're saying, I want to make sure that nobody can come in through the internet to get to the data that's on this system. So we're not even going to put it on the internet. So, and we're going to keep it physically away from everything and everybody else. So isolation is a key component, can be a key component of implementing confidentiality as well. Besides the CIA triad, our next kind of biggest, most important set of concepts is this thing called the AAA services. I add I to it because the I stands for identification. That's actually kicks off the AAA services. It helps you understand it a little bit better. So here's the example I like to give. Let's say I'm going to a nightclub, right? Or I'm going to like a fancy party that has a guest list. And I walk up to the bouncer, right? I walk up to the doorman, whoever, and I'm like, hey, I'm Will. I should be on the list. I'm here for the party. The bouncer's gonna look at their list and be like, okay, yeah, I see you. I see your name here. But they're gonna say, hey, I see your name, but can you show me some ID? So I pull out my driver's license, show them my ID, and they're like, okay, you good to go. Come on into the party. All right, okay. So what have I done there? First up, when I told them my name is Will, I identified myself. Identification is the act of telling someone who you are. We do that in computer systems as well, right? When we go to our computer and we type in our username, or we go to that website and we type in our username, we're announcing to the system, this is who we are. But does the system just take our word for it? No. The system's like, hey, what's your password? I want you to prove your W Sanders 2023, right? Prove it to me. Give me that secret password that only you should know, or give me that PIN code that only you should know. So the same way the bouncer was like, hey, like show me your driver's license to prove you're Willie Sanders. Your systems are going to say, prove you are who you say you are. And that process is called authentication. Just kind of to set your expectations for security, right? Because a lot of times when people think of like securing a system or securing access to a system, they think about protecting their passwords. But I want you to protect more than your password. I want you to protect your username too. Because think about that, right? Identification and authentication are part of your login process. You need both of those things in order to effectively log into a system. So if I make my username publicly available, like somebody comes up to a computer and the username is already there, haven't I given them half of my security already? Right? They don't have to even guess what my username is. I gave it to them. So now all they got to do is figure out the password. And they might be able to use that username to wage some type of information campaign on me, do some phishing to try to trick me into giving up my password. All right, so protect both of those things. There's settings that we can do on systems that will prevent our usernames from displaying on the computer right when somebody goes to log in. So that way, the person, if somebody's trying to compromise your system, they have to get your username and your password. So now you're taking full advantage of that authentication method. All right, so I get authorized. They let me in the party, right? I said I'm Will. I showed them my ID. They're like, yeah, come on in the party. So I'm in there, I'm partying, right? I'm partying. I'm working my way through the room. I get back to the back of the room where the velvet ropes are, and that's the VIP section. And I try to go in the VIP section, and they're like, there's another bouncer there, by the way. And he's like, excuse me, this is for VIPs only. Are you on the list? So I'm like, yeah, I'm Will. I mean, I was invited to the party. I'm Will. I should be on the VIP list, right? So he pulls out his list, and he's like, don't see any Will here, buddy. I guess you're not getting in the VIP section. All right. So authorization. Just because I was authenticated and I was allowed into the system doesn't mean I get to do whatever I want once I get into the system. It's like going to a hospital, right? I can go into the visitor center, right? But there's going to be some areas in the hospital they're going to be like personnel only, and you got to have like a badge code to get in there. I can't just walk up into that part of the hospital. Or you go to visit somebody's house and they let you come into the house, right? You announce yourself, they let you in the house, but that doesn't mean you have permission to rummage through their refrigerator or go up into their bedroom and start going through their closet. No, just because you're authenticated to get in doesn't mean you're authorized to do whatever. In systems, we control authorization through the use of permissions. We talked about this in a previous lesson. So, but remember, permissions are important for setting those boundaries of what a user is allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So we have that. We got that authorization. I'm back in the club, right? Velvet rope, can't go back there, but I'm mad about it. I'm like, man, can't get back here. So now I'm out here. I'm still partying, but I got a chip on my shoulder now. So somebody bumps me. I'm like, man, why you bump me? Push him. He pushed me back. Then the bouncers rush over because guess what? Even though I was authorized to come into the party and have fun, doesn't mean that they weren't watching me. They got bouncers all over the place, keeping an eye out on things. Security guards keeping an eye out on things, and they see this altercation and they're like, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that in here. You got to leave, sir. Sorry, but you got to get out of here. So they tell me to get out of this. So I'm gone now, right? So I get kicked out of the party. This is in my personal life. I've never been kicked out of a party, so chill. But I'm just saying I've seen people get kicked out of the party this way. So they're out of the party, right? I get kicked out. Why? Because they were keeping an eye on me. That act of watching you, even though you're in an authorized space. We call it accounting. Sometimes you hear it called auditing. But it basically just means that even though I let you in, I trust you. I trust you to a certain degree. I'm going to still trust and verify. I'm going to watch you to make sure that you are staying within the bounds of those permissions that I've given you authority over, the things that I've given you authority to do. All right. So we have to do those things and implement systems that can help protect those things and implement those things in order to keep our systems safe. This framework is also going to help with two other really important concepts in security. One is called the principle of least privilege, and the other one is non-repudiation. The principle of least privilege basically says you're only going to give somebody the access to the resources they need in order to do their job and nothing more. If I'm the janitor, I might need email access. I might need access to the payroll system to put my timesheet in. But I don't need access to the Windows server management system where I can configure how the business applications work in our environment. That's beyond the scope of what I'm doing for my job. And if you give somebody that access, even if they're not malicious, people get curious. If I can get into something I'm not supposed to get into, I might go in there poking around. And while I'm in there poking around, I might break something. And then next thing you know, we got a compromise. And who is that on? Is on both of you. Is on the person who shouldn't have been in there messing around with stuff that they weren't supposed to have access to, but it's also on you as an admin because you should have never gave them the access in the first place. All right, and then next is non-repudiation. This is the ability, or the assurance rather, to remove someone's ability to deny that they did something. So, for example, if somebody's like, hey, that wasn't me getting in a fight in the club, but then the bouncer was like, well, I physically saw you. We got some video footage of you getting into the altercation. And then we got like 10 witnesses. You can't at that point deny really that was you. It's too much correlating evidence for you to deny it. We can replicate that in electronic systems with things like digital signatures, date and time stamps, logs. That's part of that accounting and auditing piece. That's huge. Logging is huge for accounting and auditing. But all those things can combine together to create this setup where a person can't deny, or a system can't deny that something occurred. So that's another important concept for cyber. There are a bunch of protection mechanisms that you need to be aware of. These are different ways that we can apply the confidentiality, integrity, and availability concepts and kind of put them into active use. We do that through the implementation of something called controls. And these security controls, are things or methodologies for, again, protecting confidentiality, integrity, or availability. The mechanisms you need to be aware of are layering, abstraction, data hiding, and encryption. So let's take a look at them each individually. Layering, sometimes you'll hear called defense in depth, is the process of stacking up multiple security controls on top of each other, layer after layer after layer after layer, so that you have a situation where you're not just relying on one security solution to block a bad guy from getting in or getting access to your resources, and you're setting them up to be frustrated, right? A bad guy, a threat actor, would rather go after an easy target than a hard target. By implementing defense in depth or layered security, we make ourselves a harder target to go after, and then they might throw up their hands and say, you know what, I'm just going to go after somebody easier. Here's an example. Let's say I have I'm an investor and I want to invest in something tangible. So I start buying gold bars. So I got like 10 gold bars, right? That's what I invest my money in. And I want to protect these gold bars because I know people want to steal my gold bars. So what I do is I go out and buy a safe, and I'm like, I lock them up in my safe. Boom. That's my security measure. Got a safe. But then I think around, man, these gold bars are worth a lot of money. And only thing I protect them is the safe. What if somebody breaks in my house and just steals a whole safe? Let me get some better locks on my doors and windows. So I pay some extra money. I get my locks and on my windows and doors upgraded. Okay, I'm feeling a little bit better now. But man, these gold bars still worth a lot of money. What if I get like a camera system with like the floodlights on it? Let's do that. Let's get the camera system, get the floodlights. Now somebody come in the yard, boom, lights, camera, action. So if they try to pick my locks, they're gonna be on camera the whole time. And then if they get in the door, then they gotta steal my safe. Find it first and then steal it. Not enough though. What if I put like a fence around my yard that you have to get buzzed into the fence? Then you could come in. And then, so now the bad guy would have to get past my fence. They got to get past the floodlights and all that stuff to get to my safe. But I still need one more thing. I'm missing something. Attack dogs. Let's get some guard dogs roaming the yard. Like, what? Try to come get this gold. Right? So now the bad guy has to get through my fence, past my attack dogs, past the floodlight camera combo, pick my lock, find my safe, and then steal my safe, and then somehow get out of all that stuff before the cops get there. Right? So now I've created a situation where if a criminal, a burglar, saw my house, even if they knew I had gold bars in there, they might say, you know what? It's not worth it. I'm just gonna go rob the house down the street because this guy he put too many hurdles in front of me. So that's what we want to do with our computer systems. We want to layer up that security, make it so that we frustrate an attacker. Because guess what? I don't care if you're a business or just a private citizen, somebody's gonna try to hack you. So the best thing that we can do is frustrate them or make ourselves as hard a target as possible. Next protection mechanism here is abstraction. Abstraction means that I'm going to make it not as obvious that I'm an individual, and especially when it comes to assigning things like permissions. And one of the best ways we can abstract an individual user's presence or role within a system is by adding them into groups or classifying them in some type of group or class or role. This is really good for doing permissions too, is actually a systems administration best practice that we talked about again in a previous lesson. Instead of giving an individual user access to something, I'll create a group. And on that group, I'll give a base set of permissions that everyone in that group should have. So for example, let's say I work for a company, we got a bunch of HR people, we create an HR group. Now, when somebody gets hired, I add them into the HR group. They inherit all the permissions of the HR group. So that's going to include things they're allowed to do and things they're not allowed to do as a HR person, right? They're doing their thing, but let's say they move on to another role in the company. I pull them out of the HR group and then I add them into another group. Maybe they're IT now. So I add them into the IT group. They lose those HR permissions, but they inherit the permissions of the IT department. Or let's say they leave the company altogether. I pull them out of the group and I remove their user account, and now they have no permissions to anything on my system. It makes managing a lot simpler. Managing things like permissions a lot simpler, because if I'm managing, people as one-offs and I have a small environment where I got like maybe 10 users or something like that, not a big deal. I can probably manage 10 users, manage their permissions individually. But what if I have 10,000 users? Now managing permissions becomes a little bit trickier. And if I'm doing it as one-offs, I'm going to mess something up. So I create groups. It's way easier to manage 10 groups than 10,000 individual users. All right, so it's abstraction. Next, data hiding. We talked about some concepts of data hiding in relation to confidentiality, secrecy, concealment, right? Isolation. Well, data hiding is a technique, a protection mechanism, out of sight, out of mind, keeping it out of the view of someone else. But this shouldn't be the one that you rely on. Sometimes people think if they hide it, if it is out of sight, out of the mind, it's protected, but you're just fooling yourself. Case in point, let's say somebody is, they want to protect their wireless network. They want to keep people who are not supposed to be on their Wi-Fi off of their Wi-Fi. So there's a feature that most, if not all, wireless access points have where you can go in and you can disable SSID broadcast. You can make it so that the name of your wireless network isn't broadcast out, so that when somebody scans for Wi-Fi with their laptop or their phone, the name of your network won't pop up, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm secure." And they maybe not have a password on that Wi-Fi, or maybe they got a weak password protecting their Wi-Fi. But they're like, "Oh, well, I'm not telling anybody what the name is, so I think I'm good." Until you do tell somebody what the name is, and they're like, "Oh yeah, there's a hidden network called, Will's Wi-Fi." And then they tell the next person, and then they tell the next person, and then they tell the next person. And the next thing you know, everybody knows about this hidden network called Will's Wi-Fi, and people are getting unauthorized access to it, and you're wondering why your internet is running slow as I don't know what. Right? Data hiding can be part of a solution, but if you're going to use it, it should be part of that layered solution. Maybe hide the network, but also give it a strong password. Make the bad guy jump through some hurdles. And then encryption. Encryption is huge. We use encryption in a lot of different settings. If you remember the states of that data can exist in, data can exist in transit, data can exist in process, and data can exist at rest. So at rest would mean like the data is stored on a hard drive. In transit means the data is moving across a network, or moving across a wire from inside of your computer to like an external drive or something like that. And then data in process means that your processor, your CPU, is actually doing something with the data. You're using that data inside of an application to act, and you're actually still working with it. Data can exist at all of those in all of those states, and data encryption can also exist at all those states. Data encryption is super important because it is literally the only defense that we have against somebody getting physical access to our data. For example, let's say you have some sensitive data stored on your computer system, and you password protect your computer, and maybe you even password protect the file that's on the computer, right? So you think I'm good. I got a password on my computer. Nobody can get in unless they get into my information, my data that I have stored on that machine, unless they can get my password. And if you were thinking that, you'd be wrong. Because what if I take your whole computer and I physically take the hard drive out of it, and then I hook that hard drive up to an external hard drive enclosure, which basically turns your internal hard drive into like a USB attached storage device, like an external hard drive. And then I plug it into my computer that I'm the administrator of, and all of a sudden your hard drive pops up like it's a flash drive, and I can just read through your files, and I can take whatever information I want. All right. So I just trumped your technical control. I just beat it by getting physical access to your hardware. So how can we protect against that? Well, encryption, right? If I encrypt my hard drive while it's still inside of my computer, the key, the secret code to decrypt that is also stored on that computer on a special computer chip called a TCM TMP chip. Sorry. Trusted Platform Module. Now, TPM chip is then going to house that. It's not. It doesn't even tell me what the code is. It just has it stored internally. That way, when somebody removes their hard drive from your computer and they try to plug it into another system or even into an external drive enclosure, the minute they power on a system, that computer that they're trying to use to access it is going to say, "Hey, what's the secret code to decrypt this hard drive?" And they're not going to know it. And now that hard drive is no better than a brick because they can't access any of the data on it. They still stole your computer, but at least they can't get your information. So these are some of those cool protection mechanisms that we're going to put in place, and a lot of your what we call security controls are based on these. All right, within an organization, when we're talking about security, just like we have job roles, there's also going to be roles on the security side. And I don't mean like you have to work for the security department, because again, remember, security is everybody's responsibility in the organization. So what you'll see is that some of these job roles also overlap security roles, because people who are serving in those areas of the company, they have a responsibility for security, even if they're not technical folks. To start that out, we have our senior managers. These are like the folks at the top of our companies or organizations, the CEOs, the CIOs, the presidents of organizations. They're included as a secure in this list of security roles, because ultimately they're the ones who are responsible for the security of the organization. Sysadmin like us, we might be the ones putting things in place, working with the technology, but the buck stops with the senior manager. Typically, things start on high and they trickle down, like stuff rolls downhill, right? The senior manager has to be the one who sets the guidelines, sets the organization's security posture, the how we deal with security as an organization. All that comes from the top. So that's why the senior manager is ultimately responsible for anything that happens in security. Think about it. When a security breach happens and you hear about it on the news, you don't hear about like a sysadmin getting fired or having to resign. It's like the CIO or the CEO. They're like, the CEO of such and such a company has just resigned following the breach, the massive data breach of da 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 da. Right? They're the ones whose jobs are on the line. They're the ones who might go to jail if something bad happens. But they're also the ones who get to call a shot and make sure that everybody beneath them follows through on the plans that they're initiating. Next, we have our security professionals. These are going to be trained, experienced network people, systems people, maybe even direct security engineers, maybe somebody trained specifically to be a security engineer. But their role is to take what the senior manager said, that high level 10,000 foot view of security that the senior manager wants to put in place, and they actually come up with a game plan to make it happen. Like, yeah, the CIO said, we have a bring your own device, a BYOD policy, where people can bring their own devices, but the devices need to be protected, right? So now, as a security professional, we got to come up with a solution to allow BYOD while at the same time still protecting our corporate information. So they come up with that game plan. Next on the list is our data owners. Data owners are going to be the ones responsible for classifying data. Remember, we talked about criticality. Is this mission critical or is it not mission critical, right? The data owner, who's usually somebody like a mid-level manager or maybe even a high-level manager, but not like a senior manager, but they're in the management structure. They typically own the systems and own the data that we're trying to protect. So, for example, let's say the data owner is the director of the HR department. The HR department has their own set of systems that are storing like employee information. That's critical data. That's a mission critical system because it has personally identifiable information in it. It's got your employees' records in it. Their social security numbers, how much they get paid, all that stuff is stored in these records. So the data owner, the HR director might say, hey, security folks, we need to have this system protected because if that gets leaked, all of our employee information is out there in the wind. So they make that call that system is mission critical or it has some really important stuff on it. And then they also can say, oh, but this other one over here, we just keep our newsletter on that system. So that one, you don't have to put as much effort into protecting it. Next, we have our data custodian. A lot of times sysadmins fall into this. Well, sysadmins can be in the security professional area too, but a lot of times sysadmins fall into this data custodian area because they're the custodian's the one who's actually implementing the protections that the security and the senior management have asked for. And we've talked about this in the past. Yeah, some folks want to do cybersecurity and they think that, oh, I'm just going to go get a security plus and jump right into cybersecurity. 9 times out of 10, that's not how it works. Most times, people move up from a custodian role, like a network engineer or a systems administrator, into security because why? Those data custodians are the ones who know how to pull the trigger on performing a task that actually secure your systems and networks, right? So from a systems administrator perspective, the security folks might say, hey, the HR director said that this server has mission critical information on it because it's carrying our personnel records. Sysadmin, can you put some stuff in place, some security measures, some countermeasures or safeguards in place to protect that server where that information is stored? So then we as sysadmins, we go and we harden that server. We implement encryption. We make sure that passwords to get access to that server are a certain length and complexity. So we actually put the things in place to manage the protection of that system. Next, we have our largest group our largest group in the security roles, and that's users. These are the people who are actually using the systems, right? So the HR director said that this is a mission critical system. The custodian hardened it so a bad guys can't just break into it. But then you got 20 people on the HR team who actually have to go into that system to do their work day by day. So that's your biggest group of users. They still need to be, even though they're not implementing any security, they still have to be in a loop, because if they aren't aware of how to keep that system secure, that's when we start having breaches. That's when we start having information get leaked. And then the last one on the list is an auditor. Now, auditors are interesting because they can be internal or external. Internal means that the auditor, the person who's keeping an eye on stuff, they're enforcing in the integrity of your systems by keeping an eye on it, making sure no unauthorized changes happen. They can work for your company. When I used to work for Pearson, I used to do auditing. One of my jobs roles or duties used to be to audit our financial systems for the division I was in. Anytime you collect credit card information or payment information, you are responsible to a couple of different federal laws, compliances. One of them is called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. There's another one called PIC DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. But you're responsible for those things, because if you're not in line with what they say you need to do, then those different industries, those government agencies could hold you liable, right? So you have internal auditors to make sure that your security that you have in place is actually keeping stuff secure. But then you'll also have external auditors. There's companies who specialize in doing, from the outside in, audits of organizations and then giving them a report on the stuff that they need to fix in order to be compliant with federal regulations or industry guidance. So auditing as an auditor is another important piece, important role rather. Two more concepts: due care and due diligence. This one kind of ties into the auditing that I was just mentioning before. But in order for you to show that you are doing what you need to do as an organization or as an individual in order to keep your systems and resources secure, you have to do some due care. And that means you're doing everything that a reasonable person would or should do in order to protect the interests of your organization. So if a reasonable person would put a username and password on a computer, and that's what you should be doing. If a reasonable person would put, door locks on the room where their server is housed, then that's what you should be doing, right? And if you're not doing those things, then you're violating this idea of due care. And that means that you're being negligent. Due diligence goes along with due care because even though I might make a plan to say put door locks on that server room or implement password security on our systems, I still have to monitor it to make sure that plan is going the way I intended it to go, right? I gotta audit. I gotta keep track of those security controls to see if they're meeting the standard of keeping our system secure. Yeah, I had an idea to have usernames and passwords, but I'm finding out that as I'm monitoring, those usernames and passwords aren't enough. So now maybe we need to implement two-factor authentication to ensure that, even if somebody's password gets, stolen, a bad guy or unauthorized individual can't get into our systems because they don't have the phone that they're supposed to click the button on in order to complete the two-factor authentication. So due diligence is making sure that the reasonable things that we did as part of due care are actually working and actually implemented the way that we intended. Showing due care and due diligence is going to be really important, especially if something bad happens. A data breach happens, somebody loses some information, you got to go to court, your company got to go to court. The first thing the judge is going to be like, okay, the judge is going to say, hey, you had this system, you collected these people's data. What were you doing to make sure it was protected? Now, if I'm the CIO and I'm like, oh yeah, well, we put this password two-factor authentication in place. We were monitoring the systems on a regular basis. Our SOC team was tracking down different potential security breaches, and this one just got away from us, and the bad guys just beat us this time. The judge is going to say, okay, yeah, that happens. This is now like a stockholder thing. It's not a legal thing. You did what you were supposed to do, and the bad guys just beat you this time. But if the conversation with the judge goes like, "Hey, what did you do? What did you do to stop that from happening? Were you doing any monitoring?" Oh, no, yeah, Judge, we didn't really have the budget for a monitoring system. We had regular, password security in there, but we didn't have we felt at the time that two-factor authentication wasn't needed, even though we're collecting some really sensitive information on people. If the conversation is going that way, then the judge is going to be like, "You're culpable. You were negligent. You didn't do what a reasonable person in your situation or a reasonable organization in your situation would have done. 10 other companies are doing it this way. You didn't do any of that. So guess what? You're liable for this. You're going to get sued. Somebody going to jail." So due care, due diligence is really important, especially as you start to move up the chain a bit into those different security roles that we mentioned a second ago. Some more terminology around security and risk. We have threats, vulnerabilities, and risk terminology. First up is a threat. A threat is the potential that something bad can happen. And that doesn't mean it happened. It just means there's a potential for something bad to happen. If I live in Florida, a threat could be a hurricane. A threat could, if I live, in a rough neighborhood, a threat could be robbery, right? But that doesn't mean that it happened, right? It just means that there's the potential for it to happen. A threat actor or a threat agent is the entity, the person, the program, the hardware, the system, whatever, that either on purpose or by accident causes that threat, that potential threat. It causes that threat to happen. So if we're talking about, the threat being robbery, the robber, the stick up kid, is the threat actor. If we're talking about the threat being bad weather, severe storm, the hurricane is the threat actor, right? Or the threat agent. The threat event is when it actually happens. So the hurricane happened on May 5th. That is the threat event. And again, this can be man-made or it could even be a natural source. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses in our assets. So assets are things that are valuable to our organization. A vulnerability is a weakness that asset, that valuable thing has in it. So let's say the asset is this computer system that stores all of our personnel records. And there's we do a scan of that system and we find out that there's a piece of software on it that can be hacked. It has a flaw in it, has a bug in it, and that's a weakness in the system that if somebody exploits it, a threat actor exploits it, they can then take advantage of it and maybe compromise our system. But does it mean that they did it? No. It just means, again, sort of like threat. There's the potential that they can do it. It's a gap. It's a hole in the wall. It's a chink in the armor. If you know, like a separation in the armor, if that makes sense. Exposure is our susceptibility to losing that asset if a threat occurs, a threat event occurs, right? Let's say, use our hurricane example again. If I live in Florida, the exposure level for hurricanes is way higher than if I live in Wyoming, right? Because what's the likelihood of that hurricane happening in the Midwest, right? Well, that's not the Midwest. The whatever region of the country that is. They're not known for having hurricanes because they're landlocked. Tornadoes now, that might be a different story, but hurricanes, probably not because they're not close enough to the water. So their exposure level is low. What is the exposure level of us having a volcanic eruption in Maryland? Probably pretty low. I don't know if we got any volcanoes around here. So think of it in those terms. Now, risk overall, risk is actually an equation, is a formula. When we look at the threats that are out there that could potentially harm us, and then we factor in the vulnerabilities of our assets, that actually gives us risk. And for our purposes, we don't need to go into the mathematics, if you will, of it. Just understand that your threats and your vulnerabilities combine together to determine your risk level. The more vulnerabilities your asset has and the more threats that can act on those vulnerabilities, the higher your level of risk. So how do we reduce risk? We try to close up some of those vulnerabilities. The threats might still be there. A lot of times we can't do anything about the threats. But as we close up those vulnerabilities, the threats now have nothing to go after. So then we reduce the risk. An attack is an exploitation of vulnerability by a threat agent. So attack is similar to the threat event that we talked about. And a breach is a security mechanism, is when a security mechanism like a firewall or password security, when that actually gets circumvented. The bad guy beats those security controls and they get in. So a lot of times people like use that those terms, attack, cyber attack, cyber breach. They use them interchangeably, but they actually have two separate meanings. An attack is when you don't have any protections in place and the bad guy comes for you. You forgot to patch that server and that server had a vulnerability and the bad guy attacked that vulnerability and they got in your server. Boom. That's a cyber attack. Breach. You got that server. It had a vulnerability that you couldn't patch, but you put a firewall in front of the network to try to filter the traffic to make sure that the bad guy can't get in there to get to the server, but they got around your firewall and they got to that vulnerability and they exploited the server. Boom, you got hacked. But it's not attacked at that point. It's a breach because they had to jump a hurdle in order to get to the thing. You try to stop it. Attacks, you didn't have your guards up at all. A breach, you had your guards up, but they still snuck a punch in there. And then a safeguard, or sometimes you'll hear called a countermeasure, is anything that we're going to use to try to remove or reduce the number of vulnerabilities that our systems or resources have. And this is our way of protecting ourselves. All these things kind of work together. They influence each other. So for example, if we're working our way around this loop here, you're going to have assets, those things of value in your organization. Those assets are endangered by threats, the potential of something going bad. If a threat actor finds out about one of those threats, and they also find out you have a vulnerability to them, they might try to exploit those vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are going to result in your exposure, depending on how prevalent that vulnerability is in your environment. The exposure, that threat and vulnerability, and your level of exposure, it all kind of totals up to your overall risk to being compromised. We can reduce those risks by implementing safeguards, which again reduce the level of risk. And as we implement those safeguards to reduce that risk level, we increase the level of protection of our assets. And the reason this isn't a cycle is because those assets aren't static; they change. Right? I add a new piece of software to my computer. I do a Windows update. I add a new device to the network. Every time a change happens, this needs to be reevaluated because now there's potentially different threats. There's potentially different vulnerabilities. So I'm going to need different safeguards. My risk is going to change. So I'm going to need different safeguards. So this is an ongoing cycle that needs to be addressed as you're looking at your IT environment. Let's look at some of these threat actors a little bit closer because they have different motivations. Understanding how a threat actor thinks and what motivates them will help us to protect against them. So first up, we got our script kiddies. It's a derogatory term. It's basically saying that these folks don't really know what they're doing. They went out on the internet and they found somebody else's code and they just ran that person's code to see if they could compromise. They found a virus that was already made and they tried to throw it out there randomly to see if they could make somebody's computer crash, right? Script kiddies, minimal skill. Hacktivists tend to be a little bit more skilled, but they focus their hacking activities on trying to accomplish some type of activism goal. They're animal rights activists, and they found out that this science lab down the road is testing their products on animals. They're like, we're not for that. So they say, okay, we're gonna deface their website and we're gonna let people know that these folks are testing out their products on animals. And then after we deface their website, we're gonna launch a DDoS attack to take their whole network down. That's a hacktivist. They're hackers, but they're hacking for some type of activism means or goal. Next, organized crime. Anytime there's money to be made, there's going to be criminals who want to steal it, right? So tons of financial transactions happen online, right? We do most of our financial transactions online nowadays. So of course there's going to be a criminal element there trying to steal and get money. Cybercrime is like a multi-billion-dollar industry right now. Nation states and APTs, or advanced persistent threats. These are well-funded, government-backed hacking collectives. They're literally like military or paramilitary groups who, on behalf of their governments, most times are waging cyber war on other countries and even individuals so that they can steal resources and compromise targets. The insider, this is somebody who actually works for your organization, and they have a certain level of authorized access, but then they're using that authorized access to do unauthorized things. They're probably the hardest to track because, again, they're supposed to be on your network. They're just doing stuff on the network that they're not supposed to be doing. Did you follow that? They're supposed to be on your network, but they're not. But they're doing things on your network that they're not supposed to be doing. The competitor. This is another one, and this is real. This sounds like something from the movies, but you have organizations, rival organizations, Company A and Company B. They both do the same type of business. Company A is killing the game because their research and development is on point and they keep coming out with the next big thing year after year after year. And Company B is like, man, they keep beating us year after year after year. Let's hire somebody. Let's hire a corporate spy to get into their company, steal their research, and then give it back to us so that we can come out with the next best thing this year. It happens. Anytime you're dealing with big, large amounts of money, then you're going to have stuff like that happen. So the competitor, the corporate espionage is real. And then last, we have nature. Nature itself can be a threat actor. Natural disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes and floods, they cause a disruption in availability. And remember, we said CIA triad, availability is one of the things that we're trying to protect, but it's also one of the things that gets attacked. So if a hacktivist does a DDoS attack and takes down my server, it's unavailable. But if a flood happens and it takes out the power to my building, my server's still unavailable. So different means, same end. Let's look a little bit closer at these threat attributes. So as we look at those different threat actors, we can group them in different ways, right? We can classify them in different ways. Uh, some of them are internal, like think about the insider threat. Even the competitor, the corporate spy, becomes internal because a lot of times a corporate spy gets hired by the competitor's company so that they can see the inner workings of the organization. You'll also have external. So your script kiddies, your hacktivists, they're external and they're breaking in from the outside. Your threats can be man-made or natural. Man-made, of course, things like uh, viruses and hacking and stuff like that. That's man-made. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, that's natural. The level of sophistication of these threat actors is going to vary, ranging from like the low skilled script kiddies to the mid skilled hacktivists to highly skilled advanced persistent threat nation state backed cyber soldiers. Resources and funding. Again, you got your low funds, minimal resources. Script kiddie might be literally some kid or some guy in his basement hacking away, trying to use other people's malware to compromise systems. They don't have a budget. They don't have any financial backing. It's just them in the basement doing their thing. Or on the other end of the spectrum, they could be well funded. They could be being bankrolled by a criminal organization that's got multi-millions of dollars, and they're basically working this like a job. They come in 9 to 5, and all they're doing is hacking people 9 to 5. That's their job, right? And they get a paycheck for it, right? Make like $100,000 a year doing as a cyber criminal, right? So that the funding could be a source of differentiation. And then last one here, intent and motivation. Notoriety might be the script kiddie or even a hacktivist motivation for doing what they do. Some people will do it just for curiosity. Oh, can I get into that system? Some of it is political. My government wants to attack your government. We might be doing it. Think about the Ukraine and Russia right now. They're battling with tanks and stuff, but there's also an information war going on too, or disinformation war going on too. So it could be political motivations behind these cyber incidents. Financial, definitely. Our organized crime with ransomware, financial is the only motivation. They don't care who it is. They don't care if it's, uh, Wells Fargo or your grandma. They're going to steal their money. And that's their motivation. And then revenge. If I'm a disgruntled worker, I'm the insider threat. Maybe I caught wind that you're about to lay my department off. I'm like, oh, you ain't laying me off without a fight. And now I'm in there and I'm trying to compromise your system. I'm trying to set up some malware to explode once I leave the organization. That could be a motivator. How do these bad guys implement their attacks? Well, one big way is through malware, which is short for malicious software. Also a special type of malware called crypto malware. This is a newer format, but sometimes you'll hear it referred to as ransomware. Crypto malware uses cryptography or encryption against that. So a lot of times cyber criminals will take things that were meant to protect our systems, and then they'll flip them and they'll use them in a way that can potentially be harmful to others, right? So encryption is one of those things. We're supposed to be encrypting our data so that other unauthorized people can't get into it. But what the bad guys will do is they'll encrypt your data and then hold the decryption key for ransom, hence the name ransomware, and say, hey, unless you pay me, hundreds of dollars in Bitcoin, you're not getting this key back, and you won't be able to get access to your data anymore. So those are kind of two broad classifications of malware, and then some of the popular sub classifications are listed here. We got things like viruses, which is like one of our oldest forms of malware. Worms, Trojan horses, which pretend to be legitimate software. Rootkits, keyloggers. You can read through the list, some of the details of those different malware. But again, all the thing that they all have in common is they're a piece of software that somehow has to get installed on your system or on your network in order for them to do their malicious activities. Social engineering is another very successful way that that cyber criminals take advantage of users, take advantage and compromise systems. Social engineering is different though from malware, because social engineering doesn't look to necessarily compromise the technology. Instead, social engineering is trying to compromise the person using the technology. You're going to trick somebody into giving you something that they typically wouldn't give up, right? So what you'll find is with social engineering attacks, they're usually trying to manipulate a person, not necessarily manipulate a system. And then as they manipulate that person, they'll probably get information from them that will then help them to break into the system later on. And it could be something, social engineering could be something as low tech as what we call shoulder surfing, which is basically like looking over somebody's shoulder while they're typing on a computer, typing a password in or something like that. You ever notice that when you go to the ATM, it's customary to stand like way back from the person who's actually at the ATM taking their money out? That's to let them know that I'm not trying to shoulder surf you. I'm not trying to look over your shoulder while you type in your PIN number for your ATM. It's like a courtesy thing. But they can start to get sophisticated too when we start talking about things like watering hole attacks, where you find out, you do some reconnaissance and you find out, hey, the people who work for this company, they all like to visit this website a lot to read about whatever. And so what I'm going to do in order to try to get some information so that I can later on wage a cyber attack against that company is I'll poison the watering hole. I'll put some misinformation in there. I'll put a virus on that website so that when people come to the website from this company to visit and read, I'll infect their machines, and maybe that gives me helps me collect enough information to launch the next phase of my attack. Social engineers are super effective because they employ some of the same tactics that sales professionals use, which is funny, right? And social engineering is, again, it's nothing new. Even before computers, people were social engineering. They just called it conning. You're conning people. So you use some of those. They use some of the same techniques that salespeople and con men have been using for hundreds of years. But now they're using it to get information about systems and access codes and things like that from individuals. So actually two of them that I like to call out are the sense of scarcity and sense of urgency, because you see that in sales all the time, right? The Macy's one-day sale for one day only from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Come get great deals on this while supplies last. One per two items per user or per customer, right? What are they doing with that? They're setting you up for urgency. You only got one day to do this. If you miss it, it's done. Now we all know Macy's is always having a one-day sale, right? They're having a one-day sale like once a month. But for the sake of that commercial, it's only today, one day only between these hours, not even a whole day, just this one time block. And then that reinforces that idea of scarcity. There's limited supply. And then when you get in there, because they herded everybody in during that one time block, now you see stuff flying off the shelf. And you're like, oh, it's not enough. I didn't really want to buy that, but I see everybody else is buying it. Let me get one too. Right. So our social engineers use those same tactics to try to get us to do things, give up information that we wouldn't normally give up. Hey, well, this is a limited time offer. So if you really want to take advantage of this, you just need to give me, I'm going to need to place the order right now. I can take your credit card, your card number right here over the phone, and we can get you locked in. And the person, if they're not aware, like, man, yeah, I usually don't like to give out my credit card number over the phone, but you know what? This deal, I can't pass this deal up. Hey, here's my credit card number. Here's the expiration date. Here's the CVV code. Next thing you know, your identity's stolen. Right? So these are things to look out for. Tactics that social engineers try to use. Jumping back to malware, because there's so many different variations of malware out there, different organizations have tried to come up with a way to better manage and classify them. One of the popular methods of classification is something called STRIDE. This is a mnemonic device that Microsoft came up with when they came up with their threat model, their way of basically sorting all of the different malware that's out there. STRIDE stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. Spoofing just means pretending you are somebody that you're not. So kind of like the social engineering stuff I just talked about. But you can do it with systems too. You can use software to make your system look like a system that is not. So any type of malware or cyber attack that tries to do this tricking you into thinking there's somebody they're not, those are classified as spoofing. Tampering is going in there and making unauthorized changes. Any malware that tries to do that, to change a system without the proper permission, is classified under tampering. Repudiation, which is the opposite of non-repudiation, which we talked about earlier, means that I'm creating a scenario where I can deny that I did something, or my system can deny that it did something. So that would be beneficial to a cyber criminal if they could say, hey, you can't prove it was me because you don't have the correlation, you don't have the information to rule out that it could have been somebody else. Information disclosure, sharing information with somebody who wasn't supposed to see it, so breaching confidentiality. Denial of service, that's an attack against availability, making something that should have been available to a user no longer accessible. And then elevation of privileges. This is one that we haven't really touched on before, but this a lot of times is the main goal of most malware. It wants to, because usually when somebody's system gets compromised, it's a standard user that gets compromised, like your everyday user who can log into their account and do their work, but they can't do administrative level stuff because maybe they're not an admin. Elevation of privileges is the next phase of an attack. If I'm a cyber criminal and I get that standard user account access, the next thing I want to do is make that standard user an administrator, because now I can do administrative stuff like install other software or scan for other networking devices and then start moving my way around your environment. All right, so we talked about risk. We talked about some of the terminology around risk, and we learned that risk is this formula: threats times vulnerability total up to your risk. And so we can calculate risk. So we can tell when something's risky or not risky. But now that we know that something's risky or not risky, what do we do with that information? Well, there's a couple of things that you can do. First, one option rather, is you could avoid the risk. You can say, this is too risky. I ain't doing it no more. Let's say we're looking at a risk, because risk isn't just technology. We've been calculating risk, for a long time. Think of like insurance adjusters. That's what they do all day long. They calculate risk. They're not IT people, but they calculate risk. You calculate risk every day. You get up in the morning, right? You get up. You're about to go to work. You hop in your car, right? You calculated a risk. Now there's a risk every time you get in your car. And get on the road. There's a risk you could get in an accident. There's a risk your tire could blow out. There's all these different risks, but you hopefully you take all those risks into account, and then you factor in the reward, and you say, okay, because of the reward, I get to go to work. I get to get paid. I get to keep my house and pay my bills, because that reward outweighs the risk of driving every day. You decide to drive. But there's some people who avoid it. They're like, in where I live in this city, it's too many accidents. I know I'm gonna get in an accident if I drive in this city, so I'm gonna avoid the risk of driving altogether, and I'm gonna take public transportation. I'm gonna catch the bus. I'm gonna catch the metro. So that's an example of risk avoidance. You just stop doing the activity that could cause you risk. In a IT space, that might mean not using a software that we found to be risky. It might mean, not storing information locally because it's too risky. So we just avoid it altogether. Most times, though, that's not an option. So what we might do instead is we might transfer the risk. Let's talk about the car example again. When we decide to drive, it's not that we're saying, oh, we're just going to accept the risk. We're saying, hey, well, in some states they require, in others it's optional. You might say, hey, yeah, I do have to drive. There is this risk, but if I get car insurance, then if I get in an accident, at least and it's not my fault, at least the car insurance company will pay for my car to get fixed. That's risk transference. You transfer the cost of the loss that you might face to another organization, like an insurance company. They have that in the cyberspace now. They have cyber insurance. So if your organization gets breached and it's been found that you did your due diligence and your due care and due diligence, and you weren't negligent, then your cyber insurance can kick in and cover the cost of like lawsuits and things like that you might face as a result of that breach. So you can transfer it off to another organization. What we as technology professionals, a lot of times, what we're going after is we're going after different ways to mitigate those different risks. Mitigate means to reduce them to an acceptable level. So, yeah, I got this server. There's a risk of me. Well, let's do a non-technical example. Back to our car example, right? Yeah, I have insurance. I'm transferring some of the risk, but I also still want to make sure that I'm not using my insurance all the time because they're going to drop me. So I mitigate some of the risks of, car accidents by making sure that before I get in my car, my tires, air pressure is always up to par. So I don't have a blowout on the road. That's minimizing one of my risks. I make sure that, my turn signals and lights are functioning, reducing the risk. I'm making sure that mechanically my engine is up to par so that my car won't stall out in the middle of the highway and then somebody rear end me. I'm mitigating some risks. I make sure that when I'm driving, I always check my mirrors and drive the speed limit. Mitigating risk. So I'm doing all these things in addition to transferring the risk so that I can reduce the risk of me driving on that road to an acceptable level. We do the same thing on our IT systems, right? We'll say, okay, I have this server and it's running this software, and these softwares have vulnerabilities. Let me patch them. Let me resolve some of the software bugs they have. That's going to reduce the risk. Also, let me put a host-based firewall on that server to filter some of the network traffic coming in and out of it, reducing risk. Let me then make sure that server is physically locked into a room that only me and the two other IT people on the team can get into. And it's protected. The room is protected with like a PIN code and and a key. Right, you got to turn your key and put the PIN code in. Reducing risk, right? So mitigation, it's huge. But at some point, you're going to mitigate so much. You're going to mitigate all the things you can mitigate, because you never can 100% I take that back. You can 100% get rid of risk, but the only way to do that is to stop doing it overall. Avoidance. So I can 100% mitigate the risk to driving by stop driving, right? I can 100% mitigate the risk of using a computer system if I stop using a computer system. But for the most part, that's not an option. So what we're going to do is we're going to reduce it to an acceptable level. Maybe the risk of driving was there was a 70% chance of me getting into an accident before I did all of the mitigations. I do all the things necessary to reduce that risk. Now, because I'm acting as a safe driver, I've reduced my risk of getting in an accident down to 20%. And I say, you know what? I can live with that. I can eat that risk. The reason I use that term is because we a lot of times call the ability or the likelihood of you accepting a risk, we call it your risk appetite. How much risk are you willing to eat? Right. So I'm not willing to eat 70% risk, but I could eat 20% of that risk. I can take that on, and then because then I can transfer some of it to my insurance company. All right. But that risk appetite is going to vary from organization to organization, but we're going to be putting those countermeasures in place in order to try to reduce the risk to an acceptable level that the organization then can say, you know what, I can live with that. And then the last one here isn't really a viable option at all, but it still needs to be mentioned, and that's risk rejection. That's when you just ignore or reject the fact that a risk exists. I live in Florida, and there are no hurricanes here. That is straight up denial, right? I don't have to worry about flood insurance. It'll never happen to me, right? Risk rejection. That's the absolute worst path that you could take, because it's going to happen. You just won't be ready for it when it happens. So don't go with that one. So how do we secure these devices? These are some best practices for systems administrators, things that we can implement in order to harden our devices against attacks and just make sure that our environments and our systems stay secure. First up is device hardening. Things like doing software patches, making sure your systems are up to date. Things like that, closing down ports on your communication ports on your system so that a bad guy can't use them to get network access or into your system or exfiltrate data, pull data out of the system. All these things make your system a harder target to go after. Even adding in the layered defense, adding in the different layers of countermeasures in front of those devices or systems help to make you a hard target to go after. A lot of these things mentioned here add to that hardening process. Things like antivirus and anti-malware, making sure that that's installed on the system and that stays up to date, because new viruses and malware come out every day. So your antivirus vendor is going to release virus signatures, which basically help to protect against those new things that just came out. We got to make sure that stays updated, and of course make sure it's on the system. Patching and updates. So I mentioned that before, doing your software patches to close up those vulnerabilities on the system, making sure that you're staying updated on all your software will help harden the system as well. Enabling passwords. Some systems out of the box require passwords, some of them don't. So make sure that the ones who don't require it out of the box, you have it turned on and you have it set. And then once you get those passwords in place, make sure they're not the default or weak passwords. Having a default password is the same thing as having no password at all. There are literally websites that you can go to and say, "Hey, what's the default password to a Cisco router? What's the default password to a Comcast, Motorola home wireless access point?" And I type it, do a quick Google search. Oh, the password is admin. The username is admin. The password is admin. Boom, you get right into somebody's router and wreak havoc. Make sure defaults get changed, and make sure when you do change them, you use complex passwords, maybe even two-factor authentication if they give that as an option. Disable unused features. So if you have a system that has software on it, or has different functionality that you don't use, turn it off. Because if you're not using it, more than likely you're not monitoring it. And if you're not monitoring it, if somebody goes into it, you would never notice because you weren't keeping an eye out. And then last, remove unwanted or unnecessary software. If you're not using it at all, just take it off the machine, because that reduces that makes you a smaller target to go after for cyber criminals. And then last but not least, security awareness training. We talked about social engineering, but we didn't talk about the biggest solution for social engineering, and that's user education. Like with the malware and stuff, we can put technical controls or technical safeguards in place to help with that. But our users, the only way that we can prevent them from doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing and letting these social engineers take advantage of them is by training them, by educating them on what to look out for. Every organization should have some type of security awareness training in place, not just for their employees, but for anybody who touches their network. Temps, contractors, doesn't matter. If you have some type of authorized access into the network, you need to go through some type of security awareness training so that you know what to do and what not to do on that network to protect yourself, and what to look out for if somebody were to call you up on the phone and send you an email trying to social engineer you and mine you for information. All right. And that concludes our topic for the day. I'll see you in the next one.